At the end of the 19th century, London was shaken by a wave of brutal murders with prostitutes as the victims. The police were unable to identify the perpetrator, but today his name has become known to everyone: Jack the Ripper. Without these tragic events, this man might have remained in the shadows of history, and neither James Bond, nor Count Dracula, nor even Harry Potter would have been as popular. Sherlock Holmes is the most famous literary character in the history of film and television, with over 200 adaptations, many of which are familiar to audiences. There are numerous similarities between Holmes and Jack the Ripper, more than you might assume. Spoiler: Holmes is the Ripper. Why? I will explain shortly. The story of how the legendary master of deduction came to be is just as captivating as any of the tales featuring him. In fact, the creation of Holmes is much broader than the character itself. In this video, you can expect a true detective story. I will discuss the real crimes that inspired the creation of several fictional detectives, primarily Sherlock Holmes. Okay, let's take a glimpse into the future. There are many reasons why Sherlock Holmes maintains his popularity, and one of them is his unique approach to information. Holmes is characterized by an unwavering pursuit of knowledge with an emphasis on practical application, which for the 19th century is detectives, primarily Sherlock Holmes. Okay, let's take a glimpse into the future. For the 19th century, it was almost provocative. For the 20th century, it was experimental. And for the 21st century, it is perfect. In 1802, aboard a ship crossing the English Channel, was 40-year-old Marie Tussaud, traveling to London with her son and a large amount of luggage. In the future, she will become known as Madame Tussaud, the creator of the most famous wax museum. However, at that moment, she is just beginning her journey to success and appears as one of the intriguing exhibits at the London exhibition. Among the passengers was 40-year-old Marie Tussaud, who in 1802 was just beginning her journey to success. One of the most sought-after exhibits in Madame Tussaud's museum became the wax heads and figures of famous British murderers, accompanied by intriguing details from crime scenes or personal belongings of the villains. The London public showed a lively interest in these exhibits, which significantly contributed to the building of Madame Tussaud's career. In the early 19th century, she began to notice and successfully capitalize on the growing societal interest in crime, particularly in murders. During this time, criminal stories became a popular form of entertainment. A striking example of this phenomenon is the so-called Ratcliffe murders. Ratcliffe was a residential area in the eastern part of London in the early 19th century, home to sailors, shipbuilders, and plumbers associated with the nearby shipyards. The atmosphere in the area was unsafe, as ships were often subject to robbery and foreigners from all over the world arrived at the port. One corner of this area was called Execution Dock and served as a place for the execution of pirates. On December 7, 1811, the young Marr family moved into house number 29 on Ratcliffe Highway near the London docks. In this area, where workers from the nearby shipyards were employed, an unsafe atmosphere prevailed. Ships were sometimes robbed, and foreigners from all corners of the world arrived at the port. One corner of it was called Execution Dock, and it was there that pirates were executed. Timothy, the head of the family, is engaged in the sale of fabrics. On Saturday payday, his shop is bustling with customers, so he stays there longer than usual. His 22-year-old wife Celia, along with their 3-month-old son, remains in the apartment above the shop. The Marr family also employs a 13-year-old assistant and a maid named Margaret. Closer to midnight, Timothy sends the maid to fetch oysters for a late dinner. Some may wonder, midnight, dinner, oysters. But oysters were not considered a delicacy at that time. Furthermore, during the period of industrial revolutions, there was no strict 9-to-5 schedule. People lived more freely, so a late dinner was quite a common occurrence. Midnight. The maid Margaret struggles to find an open shop and manages to stop by the baker's. Returning to the Marr house at 20 minutes to 1, she discovers that the door is locked. Margaret begins to knock on the door, and a passing night watchman joins her calls. Soon, Such a dinner time is understandable. Soon, a neighbor joins them, climbing over the fence between his garden and the Marrs, and noticing that the back door of the house is slightly ajar. Entering the house is impossible, as the narrow passage is covered in blood. Timothy Marr, his wife, son, and assistant have been brutally murdered. In such a situation, the standard solution would be to call the police. But at that time, there was virtually no police force in Britain as we understand it today. For a moment, let us pause from the horrifying story to understand the context. By the early 19th century in Britain, city residents took it upon themselves to hire security. Constables with truncheons patrolled the streets, carried more for show than for practical purposes, resembling modern badges. Additionally, there were night watchmen who patrolled the streets. After sunset, night watchmen existed in the form of typical supermarket security guards. They were not the most fit middle-aged men who could not always catch criminals and often accepted bribes. The function of the truncheon was more decorative than practical, resembling modern badges. After sunset, night watchmen resembled typical supermarket security guards. They were not distinguished by fitness or age, which meant they could not always catch criminals and sometimes accepted bribes. This likely contributed to the ironic attitude towards them. A fully fledged state police force would not be established until several decades after the Redcliffe murders. Let us return to that fateful night in 1811. After the bloody discovery in the Marrs house, Charles Horton, a representative of the private police, arrived at the scene. He merely seized a bloodied carpenter's hammer, presumably used as the murder weapon, while the other evidence remained unexamined. A few days later, investigators discover the initials J.P. on the murder weapon and begin searching for witnesses, but to no avail. After offering a reward for information, they soon receive a response from a woman who claims that a certain John Peterson had stayed at her inn. Although the initials match, J.P. Peterson was at sea at that time. However, another guest, John Williams, also had access to the tools. The police lacked the time to apprehend the suspect. Just 12 days after the Redcliffe murder, a new brutal crime occurred in the county, this time involving John Elizabeth Williams. John Peterson, whose initials match, J.P., had stayed at the inn. However, at that time, he was at sea. Additionally, another guest, John Williams, also had access to the murder weapon. The police did not manage to apprehend him, and just 12 days after the Redcliffe murder, a new brutal crime occurred. John and Elizabeth Williamson ran a small tavern. On a late December evening at 11 o'clock, they closed the establishment, and their maid Bridget went to bed. Soon, the silence of the street was shattered by a piercing scream from a man, "Murder! Murder!" It was the voice of John Turner, a guest who was at that moment hanging from rolled-up sheets out of the window of his apartment. A few minutes before going to bed, Turner heard someone knocking at the tavern door, followed by the screams of the maid and the death rattle of the innkeeper. Stepping out of his room, he noticed a figure bent over the motionless body of the innkeeper's wife. Frightened, Turner returned to his room, twisted the sheets, and began to descend from the window, shouting, "Murder!" On that dreadful night, Turner was not the only one who survived. Remarkably, Williamson's 14-year-old granddaughter slept through the entire night in her room and remained alive and unharmed, likely due to Turner's screams that frightened the assailant. These two cases, marked by brutality and occurring within such a short span of time, caused panic among. Turner is not the only one who survived. These two cases, marked by brutality and occurring in a short period of time, caused panic among the residents of London. People began to leave small settlements where everyone knew each other. In the large port city, with its many dark streets, dangers and threats awaited them. Many realized that simply closing shutters and locking doors was no longer enough for safety. The authorities were eager to quickly catch the murderer and calm the public. John Williams was arrested, and soon he took his own life in prison, which the officials considered a confession of guilt. They stated that if he had not been guilty, he would not have acted in such a manner. Despite the lack of convincing evidence confirming Williams' guilt, no one delved deeper into the case. To appease the public, his body was displayed on the streets and then buried at a crossroads. However, the most captivating aspect of this story was the reaction of society. After the first crime, crowds of people rushed to the Marrow house, curiously examining the bodies of the victims. If detectives had existed at that time, they would have found it difficult to conduct an investigation due to the sheer number of onlookers at the scene. He was buried at a crossroads. If detectives had been working at that time, they would have found it difficult to gather evidence for the investigation, as the onlookers trampled all possible clues. It is worth noting that in the 19th century, people were much more composed when confronted with the sight of a corpse. Today, we are tied to hospitals for births, treatments, and end-of-life care, whereas 200 years ago, all of this took place at home. Corpses no longer shocked those around them. If one could not visit the crime scene, details could be learned from newspapers. The murder on Redcliffe Road became one of the first modern media sensations, initiating a new genre of journalism. Reports on sensational crimes, with an emphasis on the most scandalous and shocking facts. From this moment on, murders became one of the main entertainment events in Britain. Following the crimes on Redcliffe Road, the next sensation was the Lustrial murder. In October 1823, John Fertile invited William Weir to a cottage of an acquaintance to drink and play cards. John organized boxing matches for money, and William was also part of his circle. In fact, The purpose of the invitation was a substantial sum of money that the next sensation after the crimes on Red Cliff Road was the so-called Elstreel murder. In fact, the purpose of the invitation was a significant sum of money that William brought with him. Fertile and two accomplices killed William Weir. The subsequent actions of the accomplices can be considered some of the clumsiest crimes. First, they threw the body into a pond near the house, but realizing it was a poor choice, they brought it back. Then they moved the body to another pond that was farther away. After that, the friends returned to the cottage where they joyfully sang songs and ate pork chops until dawn. The Elstreel murder caused a real sensation and became a source of inspiration for many writers, including Dickens. Newspapers published new details of the tragedy, capturing the interest of readers. The British did not limit themselves to just reading newspapers. Mass processions began to take place at the crime scenes, and the most enterprising organized special tourist routes. When creditors began the sale of items from that very cottage, they were literally swept off the shelves. The main driver of interest in the murders became the so-called news pamphlet, the simplest and cheapest way to disseminate information. The main factor fueling public interest in the murders was the so-called news pamphlet, a simple and inexpensive publication with information printed on one side. It is important to note who read these pamphlets. Despite their poverty, most townspeople were literate and could read. Books were inaccessible to many, so news pamphlets served not only as a source of information, but also as a means of entertainment. Sometimes, descriptions of the crimes were accompanied by gruesome illustrations, images of the perpetrator, the victim, and bloody scenes. Some cases generated such a resonance that the release of a news pamphlet based on them resembled the premieres of modern Hollywood blockbusters. Initially, information about the crime was presented on a quarter of a page in the form of a brief sketch, a sort of teaser. Then, a more extensive report spanning half a page was published, detailing the most horrifying moments of what had occurred, a kind of trailer. The largest edition was released on the day of the execution and was a special publication that gathered all the known details of the murder at that time, a kind of film. In addition to the news pamphlet, a report from the execution site was published, serving as unique materials from the set. The half-page report with horrifying details of the crime served as an equivalent to a trailer. The special edition included all the known details of the murder at that time, something akin to a complete narrative. To top it off, a report from the execution site was included alongside the news pamphlet. These were materials from the set and interviews with characters. By the mid-19th century, a form of entertainment known as penny dreadfuls was gaining popularity in Britain. For just 1 penny, readers could obtain a simple yet captivating story about fictional crimes and mysterious events. This type of literature was significantly cheaper than a full-length novel, yet penny dreadfuls remained popular. The plots most often unfolded on sinking ships, in haunted castles, or in prison cells. It was in this atmosphere that the famous phrase to begin a story emerged. It was a dark and stormy night, and similar variations. Naturally, the stories had to be truly eerie and blood-soaked. One of the publishers liked to joke with the authors, saying, More blood, as much blood as possible. In 1842, an important division was established in London, the Criminal Investigation Department within the police. Detectives, dressed in civilian clothing, were tasked with a responsibility that professional police had previously struggled to manage: solving crimes. 7 years later, what happened was, and more blood, as much blood as possible. 7 years later, an event occurred that vividly demonstrated their potential. In 1849, a cholera epidemic broke out in London, claiming more than 10,000 lives by September. However, the public's attention was focused on a case that became known as the German Nightmare. Maria intends to marry the wealthy and older O'Connor, who, although not opposed to their romance, does not offer her his hand in marriage. As a result, she turns her attention to the less attractive suitor, Frederick Manning. However, O'Connor continues his relationship with Maria, and both men begin to compete for her attention. After the wedding, O'Connor visited the Mannings quite frequently. One day, during a visit, he vanished without a trace. The couple killed him, then treated the body with lime to accelerate decomposition and buried it under the floor tiles in their kitchen. After that, the couple parted ways. Frederick Manning went to Jersey to drink, while Maria broke into O'Connor's house, stole valuable papers, and, taking not only the deceased's money, but also her husband, boarded a train. Then the couple treated the body with lime to accelerate decomposition and buried it under the floor tiles in their kitchen. Subsequently, they parted ways. Frederick Manning went to Jersey to drink, while Maria broke into the house where O'Connor had stolen valuable papers. Taking not only the deceased's money but also her husband, she boarded a train to Edinburgh. The London police swiftly arrested the murderers, which enhanced their authority. The newspaper, The Times, published over 70 articles about the Manning affair, including reports from the courtroom. The female criminal drew particular attention. Maria not only killed and stole, but also deceived her husband. Many journalists specifically noted Maria's unusual behavior for a woman, her cold composure and self-control. The execution of both murderers became a significant event, attracting 30,000 spectators. It resembled modern football matches. Among the crowd, one could find food and drink vendors, and there were paid seats, apparently, with a better view. Neighbors sold spots in windows overlooking the gallows, and the execution attracted not only common people, but also members of the middle class and aristocracy. Before the event, special leaflets with details were distributed resembling modern theater programs. As soon as the audience settled in and took their seats, the event began. Everything unfolded according to a single script: the criminal's ascent, his final speech, and the execution itself. Not only common people, but also members of the middle class and aristocracy came to the gallows. As soon as the spectators settled into their seats, the performance began. A wave of anticipation was heightened by the thought of how many attempts it would take to hang the criminal. Among the crowd gathered to witness the execution was the young writer Charles Dickens, who hoped to enjoy the spectacle. However, what he saw filled him with such strong revulsion that he became a fervent opponent of public executions. In the mid-19th century, Dickens actively promoted the work of the London police in his articles. At that time, the new detective division elicited mixed reactions, with many considering its members to be spies, while Dickens showed great interest and respect for their work. In his novel Bleak House, Dickens effectively introduced the first fully realized literary detective, and it is not Sherlock Holmes. We will discuss him later. However, to understand how and why such a well-known character emerged, a bit of background is needed. In the early 19th century, the most resonant crimes occurred far from the upper echelons of society, and residents of affluent neighborhoods felt secure. They did not become victims, let alone participants, in murders. However, soon horrific crimes began to affect the elite as well. Initially, the popularity of gruesome criminal stories in literature attracted readers, followed by actual cases of murder. Crimes among the aristocrats were distinguished by their methods. They rarely resorted to violent murders. On the contrary, killings involving poison, especially arsenic, were more characteristic of them. Arsenic was often used in everyday life, primarily for dealing with rats. However, the events sparked readers' interest in dark criminal stories, and later, real cases of murder revealed that crimes among the elite were distinguished by their methods. Nevertheless, it had another notable function. In the mid-19th century, the bright green color of wallpaper was at the height of fashion, with arsenic being used to maintain its vibrancy. As a result, the wallpaper in the parlor could cause serious poisoning. Not everyone was aware that inhaling arsenic posed a health risk. At that time, anyone could easily obtain it, and arsenic was often mixed into food. This method of murder was frequently employed by close relatives of the victim, as well as by attending physicians, which led to arsenic poisoning being known as the betrayal of the household. Not only the methods of murder changed, but also the motives. One of the most common motivations became life insurance, which gained popularity among the aristocracy. The family of the deceased received lucrative payouts, providing wives, children, and other relatives with a rationale for killing their loved ones. Many believed that the innovation in life insurance was the cause of numerous poisonings. At one point, Parliament even imposed restrictions on insurance payouts in the event of the death of children under. The family of the deceased in high society received significant sums of money, which created a motivation for wives, children, and other relatives to kill their loved ones. As a result, Parliament decided to limit insurance payouts in the event of the death of children under 3 years old. The most famous poisoner of the 19th century, William Palmer, particularly shocked the British with his tragic story. As a serial killer and a doctor, he studied chemistry and obtained a medical license to practice. The Palmer family was plagued by misfortunes. His mother-in-law died under mysterious circumstances, followed by the deaths of all 4 of his children. Initially, this did not raise suspicions, as child mortality rates were quite high at that time. The death of Palmer's 27-year-old wife marked a turning point, causing the public to question the coincidences as so many tragedies had occurred within one family. He received insurance payouts for each death. When Palmer attempted to claim funds after his brother's death from alcoholism, the insurance company expressed doubts. During the investigation, it was revealed that Palmer had actually gotten his brother drunk, which led to the denial of the payout. To improve his financial situation, Palmer decided to poison his acquaintance, Joseph Cook. Both of them were gamblers in horse racing. After a significant win, Cook unexpectedly became. The insurance company also raised questions during the investigation regarding the death of his brother from alcoholism. It turned out that Palmer himself had provided him with alcohol, which resulted in the denial of the payout. After a significant win, Cook unexpectedly fell ill. Living nearby, Palmer actively cared for his friend, but Cook's condition worsened with each passing day. Despite a temporary improvement, it was during this time that Palmer found himself in another city on business. As soon as Palmer returned, Cook's condition deteriorated once again. His health worsened each time after consuming the alcohol that his friend and doctor prepared for him. Ultimately, Cook died a painful death, and it soon became known that Palmer had repeatedly purchased strychnine from the pharmacy. Since Palmer held the position of the victim's doctor, he was allowed to attend the autopsy. He bribed the staff member responsible for delivering Cook's stomach for analysis. Additionally, he paid an extra £10 to ensure that Cook's death was officially classified as a natural cause. The trial of Palmer became the longest and most significant criminal case of the 19th century. For the middle and upper classes, the murder committed by Palmer was a true shock, disrupting their notions of safety in their homes, and Palmer paid an additional £10 to officially establish natural causes for Cook's death. This opened society's eyes to the fact that the familiar stability they enjoyed in their homes and estates could be disrupted. The murderer could be a relative, a servant, or even a doctor. One notable aspect of the trial was the introduction of a new type of medical expert, the chemical analyst. The talent of toxicologists in detecting various poisonous substances in food samples amazed journalists. They published the testimonies of the medical professionals verbatim, allowing readers to familiarize themselves with them in the morning while enjoying breakfast and the news. On June 29, 1860, the Kent family lived in the Road Hill house, built in the late 18th century in the village of Roth, Wiltshire. The head of the household, Samuel Kent, his second wife Mary, 4 children from his first marriage and 3 from his second, as well as 3 maids. The atmosphere in the family was tense, as Mary had previously worked as a governess for the children. Her status changed after the first wife reportedly lost her sanity. With Mary's arrival, the children from the first marriage began to feel a lack of love and respect that they had been accustomed to. They lived with 3 maids. Mary's arrival in the house changed the situation. The children from the first marriage lost the love and respect they had been accustomed to. On that summer evening, all 12 people in the house fell asleep. A tall stone wall framed the garden, while a security chain with a dog ensured the safety of the property. The windows and shutters were secured with bars, creating the impression that the residents of the house were securely isolated from the outside world. That night, an unknown person carried Mary's 4-year-old son out of the children's bedroom on the 2nd floor. The nanny and the boy's sister, who were sleeping in the room, did not notice anything and continued to sleep. The parents, who were in the adjacent room, also did not wake up. The unknown individual, holding the sleeping child in their arms, descended the dark staircase and headed toward the back of the house. The next morning, panic ensued over the boy's disappearance. After several hours of searching, his body was found beneath the floor of the outdoor privy. The investigation was conducted very thoroughly, but soon hit a dead end. The only significant piece of evidence was a blood-stained bib that Victorian women wore. The next morning, panic erupted as everyone realized that the boy was missing. The investigation was conducted meticulously, but soon hit a dead end. The only significant piece of evidence was a blood-stained bib that Victorian women wore under their corsets. A police stakeout was set up to catch the perpetrator, but the plan failed. The homeowner accidentally locked the door to the room where the police officers were, who by that time had relaxed with some beer. The bib itself disappeared, and the official investigation yielded no results. In light of this, the local community hired Jack Witcher, a member of a special team of 8 detectives from Scotland Yard, formed in the early 40s. Witcher suggested that the murderer could have been 16-year-old Constance, a sullen teenage girl from the first marriage, who had repeatedly run away from home and complained to friends about her poor treatment within the family. Unfortunately, Witcher was unable to confirm his suspicions, and the investigation concluded without success. While the official authorities left the Kent family alone, the public decided to continue their own investigation, enlisting amateur detectives. Newspaper publications provided interested parties with complete information about the incident, including detailed descriptions of the scene, transcripts of interrogations, and other details, creating an illusion of simplicity for armchair sleuths. Without results, everyone was confident that it would only take a little time to solve the case. In the 19th century, in the absence of internet forums, people sent their theories to the police, albeit with skepticism. Interestingly, the authors of the letters, analyzing the situation in the Kent family, anticipated only the worst. Society began to suspect that behind the facade of a peaceful and prosperous life lay something terrible, depraved, and cruel. Ultimately, 16-year-old Constance confessed to the crime, confirming Detective Witcher's theory. However, this did not improve the reputation of the police, and many Britons criticized law enforcement for their unprofessionalism in their letters. As a result, private detectives, who skillfully solved crimes, took center stage in literature. The case at Roth Hill House became the basis for a well-known detective novel. A country estate, a respectable family, murders, and a narrow circle of suspects, including the staff and detectives. Many Britons criticized the police for their unprofessionalism in their letters. The case at Roth Hill House became the prototype for a well-known detective novel. A country estate, a prosperous family, murders, and a narrow circle of suspects, including the staff as well as detectives who suddenly intrude upon the familiar way of life to investigate crimes. Around this time, a sensational novel began to emerge in literature, immersing readers in the world of the family and upper classes. Previously, crimes in books typically took place among the lower strata of society, but now the protagonists were those who had once been considered too noble to be at the center of police investigations. The more horrific the crime, and the more respectable the family in which it occurred, the more intriguing the plot became. The sensational novel, on the other hand, departed from all acceptable norms. Some authors even presented a woman as the main character and the criminal. This shock content aimed to quicken the reader's pulse, evoking shock and horror, while simultaneously adding elements of vice and family drama. It resembled modern horrors and thrillers, only framed within the detective genre on paper. In 1888, London was shaken by a wave of horrific murders. Several individuals fell victim, and the same person was accused of each of these crimes, the identity of whom, evoking shock and horror while also adding elements of vice and family scandals to the story. Several individuals fell victim, and each crime was attributed to the same person whose identity remained a mystery. The removal of organs, which became a characteristic feature of these murders, indicated that the criminal had a medical education and experience in forensic autopsies. In a letter addressed to the investigation, the killer signed with a name he began to use himself, Jack the Ripper. The image of Jack the Ripper soon appeared in literature following the release of John Brewer's novella, The Curse of Midder Square, published in October 1888, which was inspired by one of his crimes. However, another aspect is intriguing. Typically, the killer and their deeds transition from reality to literature, and in our time, to adaptations. The story of the Ripper may have had the opposite effect. The image of the Ripper as a nocturnal medic killer emerged in literature before his actual embodiment. In 1886, Robert Louis Stevenson, after experiencing a nightmarish vision, wrote the novella Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde in 3 days. The main character is a respected doctor with a split personality. During the day, he is an esteemed physician holding a prominent position in society. At night, the image of the Ripper emerged even before his actual appearance in 1886, when Robert Louis Stevenson awoke from a nightmarish vision that inspired its creation. At night, the main character transforms into a dark figure, the monster and murderer, Mr. Hyde. Stevenson's novella enjoyed immense success with readers. On August 5, 1888, the premiere of a play based on the work took place at the Lyceum Theatre in London. 2 days later, the murder of Martha Tabram, the first victim of Jack the Ripper, occurred. To a modern person, it may seem strange that a theatrical production could inspire a criminal to commit murder. However, audiences of that time did not have the same perceptual experiences as we do today, thanks to cinema and video games. Moreover, the performance at the Lyceum Theatre was notably different from others and had a profound impact on the audience. Actor Richard Mansfield successfully portrayed both roles, the esteemed doctor and the killer Hyde. His performance plunged the audience into a grave silence, which was unusual for the Victorian era, when spectators typically commented on the events and actively expressed their emotions. Therefore, when the audience at the Lyceum suddenly froze in silent horror, in playing the role of the killer Hyde, he brought the audience into a grave silence. Thus, when the audience at the performance of In the Face suddenly froze in silent horror, it indicated that they had never encountered anything like it before. The situation reached absurdity. Actor Richard Messel was suspected of the murders, as every evening he transformed into his unrecognizable killer character. The question, "Who is Jack the Ripper?" sparked public resonance. Here, the killer and the detective operated in an era when reality intertwined with fiction and fear mingled with uncertainty. A character stepped onto the stage, determined to put everything in order. It was Sherlock Holmes. Young Arthur Conan Doyle was fascinated by detectives, particularly Edgar Allan Poe's stories about the detective Dupin. Inspired by this, he began to write, experimenting with various genres, from horror and mysticism to science fiction. Doyle submitted his stories to publishers, but did not receive positive responses. The situation changed when Arthur Conan Doyle turned his attention to the detective genre. With a medical education, he created Sherlock Holmes, inspired by his teacher, Dr. Bell. He experimented with various genres, including horror, mysticism, and science fiction. Arthur Conan Doyle received a medical education, and his mentor, Dr. Bell, was an outstanding forensic expert and a recognized diagnostician. His authority in the field of medicine was high, and when Queen Victoria sought medical assistance in Scotland, he was always the one called. Bell took pride in his ability to determine not only the patient's illness, but also their profession and place of residence with just one glance. Later, he happily noted that many considered him the prototype for Sherlock Holmes. Readers were introduced to Sherlock Holmes for the first time in 1887, when the novella A Study in Scarlet was published in a magazine and later released as a standalone book. At that time, Jack the Ripper was active in the country, instilling fear in the nation. As the character of Sherlock developed in subsequent stories, he became a sort of antithesis to Jack the Ripper. The Ripper is unpredictable and mysterious, while Sherlock is logical and capable of unraveling the most complex puzzles. The Ripper incites chaos in society, whereas Holmes seeks to maintain order. Sherlock Holmes became a support for those who suffered from the fear of the unexplained murders committed by Jack the Ripper, while the police were unable to handle the situation. In subsequent stories, Sherlock Holmes emerged as the antithesis of Jack the Ripper. The Ripper is a mysterious and dark figure, whereas Sherlock is capable of unraveling the most complex situations. His stories restore order in society, while the influence of the Ripper incites chaos. Sherlock Holmes became a comfort for those who feared the indiscriminate and motiveless murders of Jack the Ripper, while the police struggled with the investigations. Holmes always succeeded in his cases. The real Jack the Ripper and the fictional Sherlock Holmes became so intertwined in the minds of Londoners that one of the few witnesses to the murders was convinced that the criminal was wearing Holmes's hat. Sherlock Holmes gained such popularity that Arthur Conan Doyle began to regret creating this character. This will be discussed later. In the meantime, readers lined up at newsstands, eagerly awaiting the publication of a new story about Holmes. One historian noted that thanks to this character, Conan Doyle became as famous as Queen Victoria. Readers were drawn not only by the intricate plot, but also by Sherlock's character, which can be described as typical of a sociopath. He has no family, but he exhibits a penchant for drugs and unconventional methods of investigation. For instance, he might use a stick to conduct experiments on corpses, but only for scientific purposes, as science is one of the key tools of the most famous detective in history. At the end of the 19th century, the British were acknowledging the influence of science on society. Sherlock's character can be described as typically sociopathic. He has no family, but he exhibits a tendency towards drugs and unusual methods of investigation. At the end of the 19th century, the British felt the influence of science on their lives like never before. Photography became accessible to the masses. Electric lamps illuminated dark streets, and X-rays emerged as a novelty. Sherlock Holmes was the first detective, both fictional and real, to use chemistry, toxicology, and ballistics in his investigations. His work included forensic examination. Thus, the character created became an important factor in popularizing this procedure and in establishing forensic medicine as a distinct profession. Holmes's contribution was so significant that the renowned French forensic expert Alexandre Lacassagne, who founded one of the first forensic laboratories in France, advised his new employees to familiarize themselves with the stories of the famous detective. It is important to note that in the 17th century, the bodies of convicts were used for dissections for educational purposes. When such resources were scarce, doctors had to turn to dubious individuals, which was illegal. The law considered it a violation not to steal the bodies, but their clothing. Gradually, the use of bodies for educational purposes became legal, but by the end of the 19th century, this topic still remained practically taboo. Primarily, the bodies of convicts were used for educational purposes, which was quite controversial and even illegal. However, the violation of the law was not the act of dissecting the body itself, but rather the theft of its clothing. By the end of the 19th century, this practice remained practically taboo, as both the church and ordinary people did not support it. During this time, a character emerges who does unimaginable things with corpses. However, Holmes's innovative approaches do not stop there. His methods of investigating crime scenes were truly revolutionary. Previously, literature had not mentioned that an investigator could collect hair and dust from a crime scene or other seemingly insignificant details that had no apparent relevance to the case. Sherlock Holmes surpassed the real methods of the police in his approaches to solving crimes. In addition to analyzing evidence at the crime scene, Holmes was the first to apply fingerprinting. The police had been attempting to implement a record of criminals since 1871, when they began photographing previously convicted individuals for easier identification. Over time, convicts were required to provide not only photographs, but also personal information, body measurements, descriptions of distinguishing features, and fingerprints. The first notable murder solved using a fingerprint occurred in 1905. At the same time, Sherlock Holmes had used fingerprints as evidence 2 years prior in one of convicts being released from prison were required to provide not only photographs, but also personal information, body measurements, descriptions of distinguishing features, and fingerprints. During this time, the famous Sherlock Holmes had used fingerprints as evidence 2 years prior in one of his stories. In addition, Sherlock was renowned for his mastery of disguise. Arthur Conan Doyle likely drew inspiration from the figure of the French detective Jean-François Vidocq. Although few had heard of him, his biography is impressive. Vidocq himself was a convict due to theft, but at the age of 34, he decisively changed his life. He became a police officer and began capturing criminals. He established the Sûreté, a Parisian division of secret agents, where new methods for capturing criminals were developed, such as maintaining files on offenders and disguise techniques. Vidocq became famous for his ability to alter his appearance to the point of being unrecognizable, allowing him to easily blend into any social group. He used false wrinkles to appear as an old man and wigs to present himself as a poor gentleman. The main point, as Vidocq emphasized, was that for a detective to convincingly portray a peasant, he should pay attention to details such as dirt under the nails. He insisted that his employees always carry a whole. Vidocq required his employees to have a diverse wardrobe on hand, including scarves, hats, and wigs, to constantly change their appearance. Holmes undoubtedly drew inspiration from Vidocq, and the methods of disguise and infiltration are still used by the police today. Sherlock Holmes embodied logic, rationality, innovation, and a scientific approach. His creator, Arthur Conan Doyle, was quite a controversial figure. For instance, his fascination with spiritualism set him apart as an eccentric individual. Conan Doyle gave lectures on spiritualism and held seances to communicate with spirits. One of them was named Fenya and offered travel advice. When the famous illusionist Houdini demonstrated a trick that misled spiritualists, Doyle did not believe it and was convinced that Houdini also had connections to the other world. This raises a serious question. How did a 26-year-old doctor with a few unpublished works, who later came to believe in ghosts and fairies, manage to create a character like Sherlock Holmes? This raises an intriguing question. How did a 26-year-old doctor with only a few unpublished works to his credit and who later came to believe in ghosts and fairies manage to create a character like Sherlock Holmes in just 2 weeks? There is still no answer to this question. Perhaps the spirit of Fenya knows, but we have been unable to make contact with it. Nevertheless, we can attempt to understand why Sherlock Holmes has become the most famous literary character in film and television throughout history. The character is universal and easily adaptable to different generations. Holmes, much like a superhero, is not confined to a single persona. He embodies a set of appealing traits: a pipe, deductive methods, eternal boredom, playing the violin, hats, cloaks, and memorable phrases. He serves more as a specific role than as a traditional character. Much of what we know about Sherlock has been made possible through film. There are over 250 movies and series featuring various versions of this character, with the first adaptation produced in 1900. Since the creation of the famous detective, each generation has been able to see numerous interpretations that have shaped his image. The main irony is that our perception of Sherlock is largely based on film. The irony is that if Conan Doyle had been a more talented writer, he might not have been able to create such a unique character as Sherlock Holmes. His stories were quite simple for the Victorian era: quick, engaging, and suspenseful. At the time, they were seen as entertainment without aspirations for literary creativity, but they have now become classics. This simplicity facilitates their adaptation on screen and explains their popularity. We cannot forget about Dr. Watson, who, as the chronicler of Holmes's exploits, made a significant breakthrough in detective literature. Although he is not as clever as Holmes, his emotional intelligence is of great importance. In this aspect, Watson serves as a contrast to Sherlock. It is through him that the average reader witnesses the events. Watson becomes a guide into the world of Holmes's unusual and thrilling adventures. The introduction of such a secondary character makes the story more human and relatable. Although Watson does not possess Holmes's genius, he has become a classic element in literature and film. These two heroes, if considered separately, would be less interesting. Sherlock would appear simply odd, while Watson would seem monotonous. From Watson's perspective, he serves as a guide into the world of Sherlock's mysterious and captivating adventures. Although he does not possess such extraordinary abilities, their duet has become a classic device in literature and film. Without this interaction, Sherlock would appear as a strange character, while Watson would seem too ordinary. The creation of such a duo is undoubtedly one of Doyle's greatest achievements. The Strand magazine, which published the stories about Sherlock Holmes, attracted up to 500,000 readers each month. Despite this popularity, in 1893, Conan Doyle decided to part ways with Holmes. This beloved British character met his demise by falling off a waterfall during a struggle with his arch-nemesis, Moriarty. Doyle himself took Sherlock's death somewhat emotionally, briefly noting in his diary, "Killed Holmes." The author sought to create something more significant. He was 34 years old and wanted to become a serious writer, not intending to spend his life on fictional crimes. Doyle dreamed of making money and focusing on serious novels. The popularity of Sherlock irritated him more than it pleased him. Nevertheless, the writer seriously underestimated his readers' attachment to Holmes. The public's reaction to the detective's death was unprecedented for a fictional character. Over 20,000 subscribers to the magazine canceled their subscriptions. Make money and focus on serious novels. Over 20,000 readers canceled their subscriptions, and the magazine barely survived. Although there likely wasn't a term for hater in the 19th century, Arthur Conan Doyle understood very well what it meant. Outraged readers began sending angry letters to the writer. Some demanded photographs of Holmes from different periods, while others even insisted on an autograph not from Doyle, but from Sherlock himself. The writer was taken aback. He had never encountered anything like it. The word fan was just beginning to spread at that time and was most often used in connection with American baseball enthusiasts. Doyle capitulated. 8 years later, he revived Holmes in the famous The Hound of the Baskervilles. The author continued to surprise readers with new stories about the detective. His last tale featuring Holmes was published in 1927, a time when the world in the detective genre had undergone significant changes and female characters began to take central roles in narratives. In the 19th century, there were several authors who created images of female detectives. The debates about who first introduced a woman detective in literature continue to this day, but that is not the main point. The important thing is that the time for change had come. Women began to occupy important positions both in society and in the detective genre. However, novels featuring female detectives did not gain much popularity. If men were the main players in society, readers preferred to see men among the main characters in books as well. However, changes occurred immediately after World War I. Women gained the right to vote and the opportunity to work in the police force. The literary scene responded instantly. Novels filled with images of female detectives marked the beginning of the so-called golden age of the detective genre. For a moment, let's return to our time. Many of you are probably familiar with the true crime genre. These are books, podcasts, documentaries, and YouTube videos that tell stories about real crimes. If you visit any channel dedicated to this genre, you may notice an interesting fact. A large portion of the comments under such materials is written by women. Since the majority of the audience for this content is women, it is worth noting that this trend began to take shape nearly 100 years ago. At that time, women occupied leading positions both among readers and among authors of detective stories. The names of well-known writers. Even on Russian-speaking YouTube, an interesting feature can be observed. The majority of comments under such videos are left by women. Although the names of famous authors from that era may be unfamiliar to you, one of them you definitely know, Agatha Christie. She modestly regarded her writing talents and referred to herself as a hard-working craftsman. Although little is known about her book Entertainment, The Adventures of Miss Marple and Hercule Poirot enjoyed immense popularity among her contemporaries and have received widespread recognition to this day. In 1934, approximately 1 in 8 books published was a detective novel. Detectives of the Golden Age sought to avoid sensationalism. Their goal was not to shock the reader, but to depict crimes committed among intellectuals in cozy homes. The crimes themselves in such novels were also characterized by a moderate style. There was no abundance of blood or explicit scenes. Old forms of violence remained in the past. Reading such works became a kind of psychotherapy. It helped people cope with the problems around them. In Europe, still reeling from the aftermath of World War I, the echoes of World War II were already being heard, and on the pages of new detective stories, readers. The crimes in these novels were characterized by the absence of bloody scenes and crude perversions. In Europe, still not having forgotten World War I, warning sounds of the impending second were being heard. On the pages of new detective stories, readers found the cozy atmosphere of old houses and intriguing criminal puzzles. Although such novels could have maintained their popularity for several more decades, World War II began. The horrors of the conflict and the subsequent liberalization led to the decline of the golden age of detective fiction. It began to seem outdated, and the traditional investigative plot gave way to new narrative forms. The main competitor of the detective genre became the thriller. The distinction can be simply explained as follows. In both genres, exciting events occur, but in a thriller, the reader is primarily interested in what will happen next, whereas in a detective story, the main focus is on uncovering what happened before. Americans became the trendsetters of a new popular genre. By the 1940s, a different understanding of crime literature had emerged in the United States. While British detectives were characterized by politeness and propriety, American ones were marked by toughness and simplicity. Initially, hard-boiled detectives were published in inexpensive pulp magazines that could easily be discarded. The main character in such novels was not a police officer, but a private investigator who, by the 1940s, a new conception of crime literature had developed in the United States. Hard-boiled detectives were initially published in pulp magazines on inexpensive paper that could easily be discarded. The hero of a hard-boiled detective story is not a police officer, but a private investigator who uses his unique slang. His manner of speaking is significantly different from the characters of Agatha Christie. For instance, it is highly unlikely that Hercule Poirot would say, "Tell your girl to hustle for some cash." One of the key differences between the new American thriller and the detective genre was not only the language of the characters, but also the style of narration. Modern detective stories resembled film scripts where actions unfolded as a sequence of shots, without excessive commentary. This innovative approach sharply contrasted with the classic British detective, in which even the description of the interior could take several pages. The detective genre gradually became increasingly relevant in cinema, including films in the noir style, thrillers, and spy movies. One of the most famous creators of murder films is Alfred Hitchcock. Growing up in a devout Catholic family in Britain, he encountered real-life brutal crimes. For instance, the body of a young woman who had become a murder victim was found not far from his home. Additionally, Eddie Thompson would visit the Hitchcock's grocery store. She was later sentenced to death for the murder of her husband. These stories inspired Alfred. Alfred Hitchcock, who grew up in a devout Catholic family in Britain, witnessed real murders. In Hitchcock's films, murder often takes a back seat and serves merely as a starting point for the plot. His approach was reminiscent of sensational novels from the 19th century. The director himself claimed that he aimed to evoke maximum fear, horror, or laughter from the audience. It was Alfred Hitchcock who laid the foundation for the popularity of the spy detective genre. His film North by Northwest, released in the late 1950s, introduced audiences to the iconic character of James Bond. The spy detective genre remained the most sought after for several decades, fueled by the trending themes of the Cold War and espionage. There is a widely held belief that violence in literature, cinema, and video games leads to aggression in real life. This assertion is often raised by officials and politicians following high-profile crimes. However, the history of the detective genre clearly demonstrates that mass culture responds to social events rather than being their primary source. The detective genre is merely a reflection of reality. Violence in literature, cinema, and video games generally does not cause aggression in real life. The history of the detective genre proves that mass culture merely reflects social processes rather than being their source. The detective is a portrayal of the world in which it was created. One of the well-known authors of the genre noted, "To understand the morals of our era, a historian of the future can refer not only to official documents and statistics, but also to detective stories." He was absolutely right. Today, we are in an era of pervasive media influence. The modern detective genre is primarily represented by the true crime genre, which has become especially popular in the last 2 decades, starting with books and television shows. Currently, Netflix and other streaming services are producing successful documentary films that enjoy widespread popularity. There are also numerous podcasts and YouTube channels dedicated to crime themes, and we should not forget the classic of the genre, Investigation Held. What the detective of the future will be like is unclear, but it will certainly remain relevant. These crime stories exist not only because of their creators, but also due to the audience's interest. The detective of the future will inevitably emerge, and it has a future.